Sir, I will just come to the point first. Here, sir, we are dealing in a very interesting case in which the reassessment proceedings initiated by the department under section 153C of the Income Tax Act was challenged by Mr. Karti P. Chidambaram and his wife before the Honorable Madras High Court. And in fact, if you will see the decision, there are 12 writ petitions filed. There are 12 writ petitions, and arising therefrom are 24 miscellaneous applications. So 6 was filed by Kartik P. Chidambaram and 6 was filed by his wife against the show cause notice issued after the issuance of 153C notice in the case of the petitioner herein. Since the case is very long and it runs around 67-68 pages, so I have just prepared a small synopsis which after this session I will share with Mr. Sinha, and perhaps he can also share with the same with the learned members and the participants. So to understand the case from the beginning, it is my duty to first put the facts of the case, the main points which was argued by the petitioner, the main points which was argued by the respondent, that is the department, and the final conclusion which has been raised by the court. And then we can have further discussion, basically. So if I am very honest, you people have to kindly bear with me because the facts and the cases are very long. I will just start. The date of the decision of Madras High Court is 5th July 2021 to start with. The facts in this case are that on 31st January 2014 and 27 March 2014, that is pertaining to financial year 13-14, relevant to the assessment year 14-15, the petitioner, which is Kartik P. Chidambaram, has sold his agriculture lands. 3 lands he has sold to one company. The name of the company was Messrs. Agni Estates and Foundation Private Limited, basically, at the cost of 3 crores per acre. And what he says that he has received the entire consideration of around 15.33 crores by check, and after that he delivered the possession of the land to the buyer. The land was sold at the guidance value. Original assessment was completed under section 143(3), and the such transaction disclosing the capital gain was also assessed in a later scrutiny proceedings. Now thereafter, almost after 4 years, to be precise, on 5th July 2018 to 9th July 2018, search was conducted by the DDIT investigation in case of the buyer of the land. That is, in our case, the buyer is Agni Estates and Foundations Private Limited. During the course of such proceeding, it is stated that small notebooks were seized and statements were recorded of one Mr. R. N. Jayaprakash, Mr. K. Narayana, and Mr. Dilip Kumar. Thereafter, on 10th August 2018, the assessing of the petitioner received the information from the DDIT investigation, who has conducted the search in case of Agni Estates. He received some information regarding the petitioner. Consequently, on 20th August 2018, the assessing officer initiated the reassessment proceedings under section 147-148 against the petitioner, and he reopened this case for the assessment year 14-15. The reassessment proceedings were initiated on the thrust that a sum of around 6 crore 38 lakhs has escaped the assessment in the assessment year 14-15 in the case of the petitioner. It was alleged that the petitioner has received cash payment in addition to the sale consideration in respect of the aforesaid 3 sale deeds. In other words, the case of the department against the petitioners was that the petitioner has received some on money from the buyer. Later on, as per the procedure, the assessing officer furnished the reasons for reopening and also the satisfaction note recorded by the additional commissioner, since it was in the period of 4 years. So the approval of CIT was not needed. So he gave the approval of additional commissioner in this case. Very interestingly, pending the reassessment proceedings for the assessment year 14-15, the assessing officer on 16th December 2019 issued the notices under section 153C to the petitioner for a block period of assessment year 13-14 to 18-19. That is 6 assessment year, 13-14 to 18-19. The petitioner was issued the show cause notice in connection to the pending assessment proceedings, and against the same, they have filed a writ petition to the Honorable High Court. Of course, I have said that I will share my entire notes with learned Mr. Sinha. However, just the dates are very, very important in this case, because when one will go through a judgment, it will feel one will realize that there are a number of dates. So I will just repeating the dates for the sake of convenience. January-March 2014, the petitioner sold the lands to Agni Estates. 5th July to 9th July 2018, search was conducted in the case of Agni Estates. Within 1 month, perhaps 10th July to 10th August 2018, the DDIT investigation of Agni Estates passed the information of the petitioner to the assessing officer of the petitioner. 20th August 2018, the assessing officer of the petitioner, based on the information received from the DDIT investigation, initiated the reassessment proceedings in the case of the petitioner for the assessment year 14-15. 12th October 2018, the petitioner was provided with the reasons for reopening and the approval given by the learned additional commissioner. It is important to state here that the reassessment, the time barring date for completing the reassessment proceedings for the assessment year 14-15, which in this case was 31st December 2019, basically. In between, before the completion of the reassessment proceedings, on 28th November 2019, satisfaction was recorded in the case of the search person, that is in the case of Agni Estates, for forwarding the seized material in the case of the petitioner. I may repeat again, the assessing officer of the Agni Estates recorded the satisfaction, the mandatory satisfaction, which has to be recorded under section 153C, passing on the seized material to the assessing officer of the petitioner, saying that there are some incriminating material which has the bearing of escapement of income. This was done on 28th November 2019. Thereafter, after receiving the seized document, the satisfaction note and the seized document on 16th December 2019, second satisfaction was recorded by the assessing officer of the petitioner for invocation of section 153C of the Act in the case of the petitioner. And accordingly, notices under section 153C was issued to the petitioner for the assessment year 13-14 to 18-19. Against that, in the meantime, the time barring date for carrying the reassessment proceedings of 148 proceeding, which was 31st December 2019, has elapsed, meaning thereby 14-15 for the assessment year 14-15, no reassessment order under section 148 was passed by the assessing officer. And on the same year, of course, including other assessment year also, the learned assessing officer initiated the proceeding under section 153C. Now, after the receipt of 153C, it is important, the petitioner does not challenge the this notice straight away to the High Court. They waited, they complied to a 153 notice, they filed the return, and only after in a later date, when ultimately the assessing officer issued them the show cause notice that as to why not a certain income be added in their case. In the month of November and December, the petitioner choose to go to the High Court in the jurisdiction. This is very relevant. I will tell you in the later stage why. Now, these are the facts. Land sold, it was assessed. Search in the case of Agni Estates. Agni Estate assessing officer transferred some material to the assessing officer of the petitioner. On the receipt of the document, he chose to issue 148, but he does not complete any reassessment proceeding under 148. Pending the assessment, the assessing officer of the Agni Estates records some satisfaction. He gives the entire seized document pertaining to the petitioner to the assessing officer of the petitioner. The second satisfaction is also recorded by the assessing officer of the petitioner, and he chose to issue 153C on 16th December 2019 for 6 assessment year. That's the block period for the assessment year 13-14 and 18-19. Now, in this situation, the matter went to the High Court. I will just read down the crux of the arguments which was done by the learned counsel of the petitioner, which I may say was very, very senior person, like Mr. Abhishek Manu Singhvi, like Mr. R.D. Ishwar. I will just read down the crux of the arguments. Very important to be noted here. Point number 1. The assessing officer, on the receipt of the information and material, elected to initiate proceedings under section 148 of the Act. Thus, he has no jurisdiction to allow the said proceedings to lapse and initiate further proceedings under section 153C of the Act. So that's what I have said. That on the same material, he has chosen to issue 148, then he has chosen to get the proceeding time barred, and on the same material, before passing of the assessment order, he has given the 153C notice to the petitioner. The entire transaction pertained to the assessment year 14-15, and hence there is no jurisdiction to reopen the case for other assessment years. This is very, very technical and relevant observation as far as the income tax proceeding is concerned, that the entire transaction was pertaining to the assessment year 14-15 only. So on the same material, he cannot reopen the other assessment year also. The reassessment proceedings under 148 of the Act admittedly lapsed on 31st December 2019. On such lapsing, in the absence of any order of reassessment, the original return of income for the assessment year 14-15 is deemed to have been accepted. Now, for this ratio, they have also quoted 2-3 case laws, mainly Calcutta Discount Company, saying that when on the same issue, when the reassessment is opened, so the assessee cannot be put into a more disadvantageous position. The action of the AO in the present case lacks jurisdiction and amounts to legal malice. Legal malice, if I may say in a very simple term, that they are of the view that the assessing officer was having some kind of personal vendetta against the assessee. So he chose to do all these things. Hence, the word used repeatedly in the judgment is legal malice. The purpose of the AO in this case was to extend the limitation, because under section 153C, read with section 153B, the time limit was 30th September 2020 at that time, which has been subsequently extended owing to pandemic until June 2021. When the materials and information relied on for the purpose of initiation of reopening proceedings under Section 147 and notice under Section 148 and the impugned show cause notice under Section 153C are same, and such material were within the knowledge of the assessing officer, even at that time of initiation of reopening proceedings under Section 148, in such circumstances, notice under Section 153C is bad in law. On the date of reopening the case, the assessing officer had the knowledge about on money payment in cash, and he allegedly received by the petitioner from Agni Estates. And only after applying his mind, he chose to initiate 148 and not 153C. Once Section 147 proceedings are initiated, the assessing officer is bound to conclude the same by following the procedures. In between, he cannot change his mind and convert the proceedings to Section 153C. And the very action indicates that the authorities have done it with a motive and the same amounts to legal malice. The doctrine of abatement in the present case is alien. 153A says that when a search is conducted in case of a person, so the pending assessment abates. So that is the second proviso to Section 153A. So the argument to nullify that was that the doctrine of abatement in the present case is alien. In view of the facts that the material relied upon for the reopening of assessment under Section 148 forms the same basis for issuance of impugned notice, show cause notice under 153C of the Act. Now this is important. If you ask me as a reader, as a speaker, this is a technical argument. For invoking the provision of Section 153C, there should be incriminating material qua each assessment year. And since in this case there was no incriminating material for the assessment year 16-17, 17-18, and 18-19, the proceeding under the said section is apparently bad in law. This is also the ratio of judgment of Honorable Supreme Court in the case of Single Education Society, that there should be incriminating material qua each assessment year. And interestingly, that judgment of Single Education Society pertains to 153C. The existence of an alternative remedy is not, however, sufficient reasons for refusing a litigant quick relief by a writ or by prohibiting an authority acting without jurisdiction from continuing such action. So this was anyway considered by the High Court. That's why it has entertained the petition. So these were the main arguments I have just told by the learned counsel of the petition. Now I will take quickly to the main contention and arguments of the respondents, that is the department. During the course of search, it was found, this is a factual thing, it was found that Agni Estate has purchased immovable property in a village called Muttupadu from Mr. Karti P. Chidambaram, that is the petitioner, Srimati Srinidhi Karti P. Chidambaram, that is wife of Shri Karti, and Srimati Nalini Chidambaram, who is the mother of Shri Karti, at rupees 4.25 crore per acre. However, in the case of Shri Karti and his wife Shri Nidhi, the properties were registered at the guidance value of rupees 3 crore per acre, and the balance was paid in cash. So this is the entire trust. 4.25 minus 3 is equals to 1.25 was paid in cash by the buyer to the seller, that is the petitioner. That is the entire crux of the case. On the contiguous piece of land owned by Srimati Nalini Chidambaram, the land was sold at rupees 4.25 per acre, and she has decided to take the entire sale consideration by check. This is very interesting. a single contiguous piece of land. One land is sold for rupees 4.25 per acre. The other land, which might be in close vicinity of that land only, is sold for rupees 3 acre per 3 crore per acre. Whereas the assessee in the present case has accepted that the part and parcel of the balance land and sale consideration 1.25 per acre in cash. The details regarding payment of cash on various dates in favor of Mr. Karti pursuant to the direction of Mr. Jay Prakash. Mr. Jay Prakash is the MD of Agni Estates, were also relied on by the respondents in order to contend that the satisfaction note complies with the requirement of section 153C, and there are materials on record to initiate assessment proceedings for the other assessment year also, that is for the assessment year 15-16, 16-17, 17-18 and 18-19. That is the block which is covered by the notice issued under section 153C. The cash payment to Mr. Karti Chidambaram and his wife Srimati Srinidhi by Agni Estates and the transaction are not reflected in the books of accounts of Agni Estates. So the assessing officer of the Agni Estates has informed this to the petitioner, to the assessing officer of the petitioner. The sale price fixed for the property was rupees 4.25 crore per acre against the guidance value of rupees 3 crore. This is very important. The cash component were paid to Karti Chidambaram from 7th October 2014 to 30th June 2018. So it contains the financial year from assessment year 14-15 to 18-19, corresponding to assessment year 15-16 to 19-20. I will just repeat the dates. It is very important. The cash component was paid to Mr. Karti Chidambaram from 7th October 2014 to 30th June 2018 on various dates, covering all the above mentioned assessment years. The sale deeds were executed on 31st January and 27th March 2014, and the date of cash payment would reveal that the cash payment was made till 30th June 2018. So, based on the incriminating material, the Income Tax Department contended that there was regular cash payment recorded in the incriminating material, which covers the entire block period. So, the contention that there should be incriminating material qua each assessment year gets diluted here, in my humble opinion. At the time of issuing notice under section 153C, proceeding under section 147-148 was not complete, and therefore the proceeding never achieved finality when the notice was issued under section 148. This is a fact. 31st December was the date for completion of the reassessment proceedings. No income was reassessed there. Pending the assessment, they have chosen to invoke 153 proceedings. Now on the point of alternative remedy, they have said that in the instant case, it is evidently clear that the statutory remedy provided under the Income Tax Act would be efficacious and exhaustive, and hence they can raise whatever they want to raise before the appellate, which technically means CIT appeal. The assessing officer, upon the receipt of the seized document, had to reopen the assessment under section 153C of the Act. There are various rulings of different forums that the assessing officer cannot maintain proceedings under section 147/148 after receipt of the seized material pertaining to such operation under section 132. So, this was the primary and main contention of the learned counsel of the petitioner. Now I will just come to the finding of the court and why they have given some finding. Before coming to that, I will just say that in this case, before giving this order, the Honorable High Court has itself called for the entire assessment record. they have gone through each and every file, and that file number has also mentioned in the order of the Honorable High Court, meaning thereby that as regards that the contention of legal malice is concerned, the Honorable High Court was more than satisfied that everything is done is as per the procedure and no legal malice has been caused. I am reading the findings of the court, the crux of the finding of the court. Once the materials seized are handed over to the assessing officer of the search person, which in the present case is Agni Estates, then the assessing officer has no option but to issue notice to such person requiring him to furnish within such period as may specified in the notice the return of income falling in the 6th assessment year, that is in the block. In view of the second proviso of section 153A, if any proceedings are pending on the date of initiation of search under section 132, then all such pending proceedings shall be abated. And I will remind that 148 proceedings were pending. It was not completed. The very purpose and object of the non-obstant clause as well as the abatement clause is to ensure that no parallel proceedings are allowed with reference to the same cause of action. So it should not be that, on the same thing you are doing 148 and on the same thing you are doing 153C. So either of the two. The scope of section 147 for reopening of assessment is not akin to section 153A and section 153C for assessment/reassessment. The assessment/reassessment under section 153A or 153C is to be done if any search and seizure is made under section 132 of the Act. Thus, the scope of section 153A or 153C cannot be compared with the reopening of proceeding under section 147, 148. 147, 148 comes with a specific package. The reasons are recorded, the issue are crystallized. So 153C proceeding is a wider proceeding. 147 is a narrower proceeding. Section 147 of the Act may be invoked by the assessing officer if he has a reason to believe that any income chargeable to tax has escaped the assessment. However, there is no such reason to believe clause or otherwise under section 153A or section 153C. These two provisions shall be invoked by the assessing officer based on the material seized during such operation conducted under section 132A of the Act and handing over to the jurisdictional assessing officer. In order to initiate proceedings to assess or reassess under section 153C of the Act, the assessing officer mandatorily should possess the seized material and other books of account. Section 153C stipulates that assets seized or requisitioned shall be handed over to the assessing officer having jurisdiction over such person. Thus, only after handing over of the materials to the assessing officer of the other person is empowered to issue notice under section 153C of that and not otherwise. So, it says that only after the assessing officer receives the material, the other assessing officer has handed over the material and the satisfaction note. Only after that he can resort to 153C, otherwise not. If at all the assessing officer erroneously proceeded under section 147 of the Act, thereafter on handing over of complete material seized or impounded during the search operation to the jurisdictional assessing officer, he is empowered to invoke 153C of the Act as there is an abatement clause contemplated under section 153A and 153C. So here, in my view, the Honorable Court has given the breather to the assessing officer by using the word erroneously. This being the constructive interpretation to be adopted, even in cases where there is a mistake in initiation of proceeding under section 150, under section 147, on receipt of the complete seizure materials, the assessing officer is empowered to invoke 153C of the Act on satisfaction and by issuing notice. So, in a implied words, the Honorable High Court is of the view that there might be a mistake on the part of the assessing officer. And if at all he has issued 147 notice, then after following the proper procedure as prescribed under section 153C, he can otherwise issue 153C notice also. Handing over of the seized material to the assessing officer of the other person would be the requirement for initiation of proceeding under section 153C. This is important. Thus, in the present case, the initial information, details and materials communicated to the assessing officer made him to initiate section 147 proceeding as he has a reason to believe. This line which I am just reading is in my view, the turning point of the entire decision. However, handing over of the seized material in entirety in proceeding dated 22nd November 2019, the assessing officer formed an opinion that it is the case to be proceeded under section 153C of the Act, and accordingly recorded the satisfaction note based on the material in order to proceed further, and it was mandatory. So, the Honorable High Court was of the view that no doubt that at the time of issuing of 147, the assessing officer had some material, but he did not have the entire seized material coupled with the satisfaction note in entirety. These material was handed over to the assessing officer of the petitioner only after the issuance of 147 notice, and then after perusing the entire material in entirety, the assessing officer was of the view that it is the case of 153 proceedings and not the case of 147/148. This the court has observed, I may repeat again, after perusing and seeing the entire files. The court observed that admittedly the seized and impounded materials of the search person was not handed over to the assessing officer at the time of initiation of section 147 proceedings. As per the files, the seized material in accordance with the provision of the Act were handed over to the assessing officer of the search person only on 22nd August 2019. This is very important. Thereafter, on 28th November 2019, the assessing officer recorded satisfaction and issued notice under section 153 of the Act to the search person, and subsequently the materials seized were handed over to the assessing officer of the petitioner, and he recorded the satisfaction. Therefore, certain information made available prior to handing of the materials would not confer any power on the assessing officer to initiate the proceeding under section 153C, because at the time of issuance of 147 notice, he was not having the entire material. He was not being handed over the entire material. So he was handicapped to issue 153C notice if at all desired by him. While the prescribed procedure, if any error is committed by the assessing officer, courts are not expected to quash the entire proceedings of assessment/reassessment. The court are bound to consider whether procedure followed is in consonance with the procedures contemplated. This is very important. In a writ jurisdiction, the court does not necessarily go into the fact of the case. They just monitor, they just supervise that what is the procedure prescribed and what is the procedure they have followed. And if they are prima facie, if I may say, are satisfied that the procedure which has been prescribed is also followed, then they normally does not entertain the petition, especially when there is an alternative remedy available. I will just repeat this line. The court are bound to consider whether procedure followed is in consonance with the procedures contemplated under the Act or not. And in the event of any error, whether such errors caused any prejudice to the interest of the assessee or not, rectification of the error is always permissible. No writ against a show cause notice needs to be entertained by the High Court. However, a writ may be entertained if the show cause notice was issued without jurisdiction. or a malified grounds. Even in case of raising a malified against any authority, such authority must be impleaded as party respondent in the writ proceeding in his personal capacity. This is very important. That if the petitioner was the case of the petitioner was that X officer or Y officer had some personal grudge or something like that against the petitioner, or they use the technical term legal malice, then that officer should have been used in the writ petition in his personal capacity. Now, I will just sum up what is my interpretation of the judgment, subject to correction by learned chairman sir. From a holistic reading of the judgment, the Honorable High Court shall be clear that the view of the High Court appears to be based on sound principles and is legally sustainable. The High Court arriving at the conclusion has gone into the facts of the case, have considered the arguments at length, the procedures prescribed in the law pertaining to reassessment proceedings and pertaining to initiation of the proceeding under section 153C of the Act. As regards the alleged legal malice, the Honorable High Court has meticulously gone through the file/case records. The turning point of the decision of the High Court, on which repeated thrust has been placed by the High Court, is that in this case, at the time of initiation of reassessment proceedings, the entire seized materials was not received by the assessing officer. The same was received by the assessing officer only after issuance of reassessment notice, but before passing of the reassessment order. Hence, to say that the assessing officer has tried to lapse the proceeding is not the correct understanding, in my opinion. The proceeding has been abated. Sorry. When the AO received the seized material after recording the satisfaction note, he initiated the proceeding under section 153C. Hence, in the given facts, the view of the High Court appears to be reasonable in my view. However, being said so, it may be also stated that it is not coming in the High Court order as to whether in the writ petition the petitioner has also challenged the second proviso to section 153A, which says that in this case, in the case of invocation of 153A, the period of 6 years will get abated. And I will just say on a technical side, this judgment is of single bench, single judge, single. So if the proviso would have been challenged, it would have gone to DB, means the bench of 2 judges. Now, speaking very technically, in a very practical situation like this, further, in my view, it would have been better that before moving to the High Court, the petitioner ought to have carried extensive inspection of the files, thereby ascertaining as to whether there were information of the incriminating material qua each assessment year to which the proceeding 153 pertains. This is a very legal argument in my understanding, because the law is settled. 153C, so many 153 is so many judgment. Kabul Chawla, Mita Gudgudia, as we all know. 153C, a direct judgment of Honorable Supreme Court. On the case of Singad, we say that there should be incriminating material qua each assessment year. So, if at all they have to go to the High Court, it would be proper that they should have gone to a satisfaction note, the seized material. So the argument which was put forward by the department would have been negated before going to the High Court, or perhaps that point might have been covered in the writ petitions. Now, in my humble view, I will just take you to some of the ratios which are coming from this judgment. Even when the proceeding under section 148 is initiated but not completed, and on a later date, seized materials are received by the assessing officer, which indicates of having a bearing on the determination of the total income of such proceedings, proceeding under 153C can be initiated. When satisfaction is recorded for triggering section 153C of the Act by the such person, and in case of the other person, the AO has no option but to initiate the proceeding of the sixth assessment year immediately preceding the assessment year relevant to the previous year in which the such is concluded, because this has been provided in the Act. There should be incriminating material qua each assessment year is the argument put forward by the assessee, but that is not prescribed in the Income Tax Act in black and white. The scope of section 147 for reopening of the assessment is not akin to 153A and 153C of the assessment of the reassessment. The scope of judicial review under Article 2 to 6 of the Constitution of India is to scrutinize the process and procedure through which a decision is arrived in consonance with the provision of the statute by the competent authority, but not the decision on facts itself. Sahab, this was my humble interpretation.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for the nicely summarizing this lengthy case study on the 147, 153, 153C, 153A, and yes, this is the High Court. The High Court has discussed all the issues in detail and going into the fact of the cases here. I have just one point to understand here. While I was going through this case study, there was a para 106 where the revenue has para 62 where the revenue has relied on the statement by the three person who has given the statement under 131 here.
132.4.
Yeah, 132.4. They have given the statement under 132.4 here.
Yes.
And they have also stated that this cash transaction was out of the books. It cannot be part of the books. So it is totally out of the books. And he has alleged that this money was being paid to the Karti Chidambaram for the October 2014 onwards here. Now, the issue arises here, how far a court can rely on such a statement, because this statement is the point through which the 153C has been triggered here. Because this is the main allegation that there is a cash transaction here. And this cash transaction is based on the sum of the statement under the oath by the three person who has given this statement here.
Yes.
The point that I'm saying, so this is the oral statement or this is the written statement without any evidence or without any evidentiary value that you cannot be able to prove here. How far this case will sustain as far as the Evidence Act is concerned if we properly scrutinize this case on the basis of the Evidence Act, saying that whether the mayor's statement under 131 can be sufficient, it can be sufficient for the purpose of triggering the 153C, but how far it will be sustained when it will be tested under the 143.3 issues here.
Sir, obviously, sir, that is a valid point, and you are absolutely correct in saying that in this case, prima facie, the court has to see that what is the procedure, whether there was some material to initiate 148, yes. Whether there was some material to issue 153C, yes. Whether the satisfaction note has been recorded by the assessing officer of the such person, yes. Whether the same has been recorded by the assessing officer other than the such person, again, yes. Now, prima facie 153C is triggered. That you also agree that 153C, there are some materials to at least trigger 153C proceedings. And they also say that each and every assessment year covered has some cash trail transaction. Now the question of surviving, that, sir, always depends, how to, obviously, what legal arguments you take before the appellate authorities, like cross-examination, and what exactly what exactly they have said in the statement, basically. It might perhaps that the assessment in the case of Agni Estate would have been over. The assessment of these persons under 153A have also been over. So all these issue has to be considered by the assessee in the case of his assessment proceedings, basically.
Yes, sir. You have rightly mentioned that part here, because the presumption against the assessee for drawing a prima facie satisfaction under 147
Yes.
is something different than the satisfaction under 153.
Yes.
Whether the satisfaction under 147 which should be a prima facie satisfaction, the assessing officer should not go into the detail, and yes, he can if have the prima facie satisfaction that something has happened. So there can be some presumption against the assessee in the case of 147. But whether this same presumption will be valid under the 153, or can we say what is the difference of the degree of the presumption under the 147 versus 153?
Sir, 147 sticks to one point, that this is your income, X income has been, he has a reason to believe that this income has been escaped. And at that time of recording of the reasons, he should have a prima facie view. There are a number of judgments that the reasons recorded by the assessing officer should be a reason recorded by a man of ordinary prudence, basically. 153 is altogether different. The statute provides that when you receive some kind of seized material, incriminating material along with satisfaction note, and when you apply your mind independently, it is not that if you receive the satisfaction note of some assessing officer, then you have to blindly rely on that satisfaction note. You, as the assessing officer, have to also apply your mind that whether the satisfaction note along with the seized document gives a prima facie view of invoking section 153 proceeding or not. Hence the word used in that section, if you read, determination on the income of the assessee, meaning thereby if you receive some kind of material, there can be any material, they might or might not have the bearing on your taxable income. So the materials should be restricted to the income which should have the bearing on your income, I mean to say, the material, basically. 147 sticks to one point. If 147 is issued on X and during the course of assessment, you say that, X now you want to reassess Y also, then for Y also, there are case laws that you have to take the permission of the senior authorities. Against, you have to issue 148 notice. 153 is open proceedings, basically. Now, 153 proceedings are akin to 153C, basically. They has to be restricted on the incriminating material. Now, taking example of this case, assumingly, the reassessment order might have passed for the assessment year 14-15 before the issuance of 153 proceedings. Suppose one part of the income has already been assessed by a reassessment order passed under section 147, 148 for the assessment year 14-15. After that, the AO receives the incriminating material along with the satisfaction note. Even after that, if he thinks that there is some incriminating material which has the bearing on the taxable income, he ought to have issued 153C notice, despite the fact that the assessment order under 140 has already been passed. Now, especially for the assessment year 14-15, since he has already taxed that income under 147, so he will not touch the income, basically. But he has to pass the assessment order, nil income, saying so that this particular income has already been taxed, so I am not touching that income. Having said so, 153C material are restricted. Now there can be other materials also. So 153 proceedings are much wider than 147 proceedings, basically.
Okay, sir. Due to the paucity of the time, may I request you to go to the second case study here also?
Second case study. Okay.
Nandi Steel here.
Yes, sir. Shall I start?
Yes, please, sir.
Very well. Now, Nandi Steels Limited, Sena Sahab has given me a relatively short case law, so it is easier to comprise that. Again, I will just, I have a style of working, so I have prepared some short synopsis also, which I will share with Sena Sahab. And if he wants, he can share the same with you. This case pertains to a traditional income tax act proceedings. No reassessment, no 153A, no 153C. Simple question based on the established law by the Supreme Court, the Honorable Karnataka High Court was pleased to overturn the decision of the special bench of the ITA. However, in this issue also, 148 issue was raised, but this decision is not an authority pertaining to 148. So that has not been touched upon. The question has been left unanswered by the Honorable High Court. I will just quickly, I will read quickly. Again, I am reading the facts of the case. In this case, the relevant facts which are germane for the issue under consideration is that in the present case, the income tax appeal was filed by the assessee before the High Court against the order of the ITAT. In this case, reassessment proceedings under 148 of the Income Tax Act was initiated against the assessee for the reason that the assessee has set off the carried forward business loss of earlier years to the extent of rupees around 39 lakhs against the income declared under the head income from capital gain. The very important carried forward business loss again set off against the income computed under the capital gain arising out of, this is very important, arising out of sale of land along with building with borewell. So assets on which depreciation has been claimed by the assessee was sold. The income was declared under the capital gain, taxed under the capital gain, and the carried forward business loss of the earlier years was set off. The assessment year, assessment year 3 in this case. After getting the unfavorable order from CIT appeal, the matter went to the ITAT and for deciding this issue, a special bench of the tribunal was constituted, which ultimately rejected the appeal of the assessor. Basically. Now I will just go through the main arguments of behalf of the assessee. The counsel for the assessee has said, the assessee is entitled to set off brought forward losses against the income, which has the, this is very important, I will use the word again and again, which has the attributes of business income. The assessee is entitled to carry forward the business loss against the income which has the attributes of business income, even though the same is accessible to tax under the head profits and gains of business. In this regard, the petitioner has placed reliance on section 72(1) Roman 1 and Roman 2 of the Act. The proviso to section 72(1) was omitted by the Finance Act 1999 with effect from 1st April 2000 for the impugned assessment year 3-4. Therefore, the assessee was not required to carry on the business for the purpose of set off of brought forward business loss. So this is an important condition. Earlier there was a proviso in section 72(1) which says that if you want to carry forward the business loss and ultimately get it settled off, then for that purpose you need to carry on the business. So that proviso was given a go by White Finance Act 1999. The petitioner further pointed out that the Supreme Court in the case of CIT versus Express Newspaper Limited, this case law of Express Newspaper Limited was relied extensively by the special bench of tribunal in not giving the relief to the assessee. The petitioner pointed out that the Supreme Court in the case of CIT versus Express Newspaper Limited dealt with the issue as to whether capital gain can be taxed in the hands of a successor company, and the issue involved in the aforesaid case was not in respect to whether the character of capital gain income was in fact a business income. So, safely so, Honorable High Court giving the relief to the assessee has distinguished the case law of Supreme Court in the case of Express newspaper, on which extensive reliance was placed by the special bench of tribunal in rejecting the appeal of the assessee. In this case, I will just also read the ratio of the judgment also. Reliance was placed by the Honorable High Court in the case of the Honorable Supreme Court in the case of CIT versus Okanda Radhaswamy Bank Limited, 57 ITR 306, and Chugandas and Company, 55 ITR 17 SC. So this was the precise argument of the petitioner. The argument of the department also, if I may say, was in this case was also relevant. The asset sold by the assessee is a capital asset, and consideration has been offered to tax under the capital gain. Therefore, the question of treating the consideration from transfer of a capital gain as business income does not arise. So, this, if I may, I'm not able to understand this point, that the assessee is claiming depreciation, but the income which he is getting from selling of the assets is showing under the capital gain. In order to consider the business income, the land which was subject matter of the sale should have been stock in trade. So if the land would have been stock in trade, it would be the business income. Whereas undisputedly the same was considered as capital asset, and the consideration has been rightly treated under the head capital gain. The business loss claimed to be set off by the assessee was carried forward business loss of the earlier years, and the same can be set off only in terms of Section 72 of the Act, which permits set off of the business loss against the profit and gains of business or profession. Therefore, Section 72 of the Act does not apply to the situation in the present case. Section 72 says set off against business income only. That is the core thing of Section 72. Section 72, subsection 1 of the Act mandates that carried forward business loss can be set off against the profit and gains of business which is assessable for that assessment year. Whereas in the instant case, the assessee has not offered any income under the head profits and gains, and it is established that the assessee has not carried on the business either in the assessment year under consideration or in the immediately preceding year. So admittedly, there was no business income either in this year or in the previous years also. The word employed by the legislature, which is in commas I am reading, set off against profits and gains, if any, of any business or profession carried on by him and accessible for that assessment year only, clearly mandates that unabsorbed carry forward losses can be set off against the income from business carried on by the assessee, which is accessible under the head profits and gains alone, and not against any other head. If any other interpretation is given, the aforesaid expression would be rendered infectious. So this was the precise argument of the department. In my view, they are legally tenable arguments because the assessee himself in this case has shown the income arising from the sale of assets, which is land, building, and borewell, under the head capital gain, despite Section 41. It is pertinent to note, now this is the finding of the code I am reading. It is pertinent to note that the proviso to Section 72(1), which now does not exist, was omitted by the Finance Act 1999 with effect from 1st April 2000. Therefore, for assessment year in question, that is assessment year 3-4, the assessee was not required to have carried on the business for the purpose of set off or brought forward of losses. So this is a clear thing. that it is not required that the assessee should be carrying on the business, even if he had lost in the earlier years. So I'm not going through all this. It is now this is important, maybe used for better understanding legal interpretation and perhaps in drafting also. The some important observation of Honorable High Court. It is well settled rule of statutory interpretation that intention of statute has to be gathered from the language employed by the legislature, which means attention has to be paid to what has been said and what has not been. Reliance is based on CIT versus Tara Agencies SC and GVK Industries SC. The Supreme Court dealt with the legal maxim expression uniqueness, exclusion, altruist, and held that express mention of one thing implies the exclusion of other. Section 72(1) of the Act employs the expression computation under profits and gains of business profession, whereas Section 72(1) Roman 1 does not use the expression under the head. So this is 72(1) use the words profits and gains of business profession. However, when we come down to Section 72(1) Roman 1, it does not use the words in commas under the head. Thus, the legislature has consciously left open that income from business, though classified under any head, any other head, can be entitled to be set off, basically. Now, in view of the aforesaid enunciation of law, it is evident that the assessee is entitled to set off brought forward loss against income which has the attributes of business income, even though the same is accessible to tax under a head other than profits and gains of business. I will just correct that if you sell some agricultural land or land, something which falls under a specific section 54 to 54 ABC, that does not have the attributes of business asset. So this is very, very important that the assets which are capital assets and are strictly following under the head capital gain will not have the same interpretation. So the catch in this judgment is the assets which are having attributes of business income. Attributes, in this case, a asset was sold in which depreciation was claimed by the assessee. I will just read out some of the relevant observation of two of the judgment on which heavy reliance has been placed by the Honorable High Court. The first is Concada Radharswamy Limited, and the second is Chogandas and Company. For a holistic view of the matter, it is relevant to reproduce some of the judgment observation I have reproduced in my note. I am just reading for the benefit of the London listeners. This was the case of interest of securities. So I will just read. Though for the purpose of computation of income, interest on securities is separately classified, income by way of interest from securities does not cease to be part of the income from business if the securities are part of the trading assets. Where a particular income is part of the income from a business falls to be decided not on the basis of the provision of Section 6, but on commercial principles. This is very relevant. That maybe for computation purpose, you can take a particular income under the head, say capital gain or income from other sources, but not with respect to when you have to claim the depreciation, etc. So the commercial aspect also needs to be given a weight. To put in other words, did the securities in the instant case which yielded the income form part of the trading asset of the assessee? The tribunal and the High Court found that they were the assessee's trading assets, and income therefore was therefore the income of the business. If it was the income of the business, Section 24(2) of 1922 Act was immediately attracted. If the income from the securities was the income from his business, the loss could, in the terms of section, be set off against that income. So here the interpretation was of section 24(2), which corresponds to the present section, that is 72 of the Income Tax Act 1961. The other case also I will just wrap up in 2-3 minutes. Time is running out. In the case of Chugandas and Company, it is very interesting to read. The heads described in section 6 and further elaborated for the purpose of computation of income are intended merely to indicate the classes of income. The heads do not exhaustively delimit sources from which income arises. So again, that commercial thing. This is made clear in the judgment of the Supreme Court in the case of United Commercial Bank, that business income is broken up under different heads only for the purpose of computation of the total income. By that breakup, the income does not cease to be income of the business. The different sets of income being only the classification prescribed by the Indian Income Tax Act or the computation of income. So merely because you have classified some income which is otherwise having an attribute or characteristics or features of business income can be considered for a specific purpose as income arising from the business only. The aforesaid case laws are relevant for the ratio that the carried forward losses under the head business profession can be set off from any other head if the same have attributes of income, and the same cannot be merely disallowed for the reason that the same is classified under any other head. The head of income under the Income Tax Act are divided for computation of income, and that does not per se change the characteristic of income merely because the same fall under other heads of income. In my view, the ratio, otherwise the set off, this ratio can also be used in other cases also. So the simple ratio, if I may say, the carried forward losses under the business profession arising from the sale of assets which have the incidents oblique attributes of business or profession can be adjusted from income arising from capital gain. This is the precise and correct ratio of this judgment.
May I ask you, sir? May I ask you a question, sir?
Sir, please.
Sir, first of all, you said though section 41 was there, they
Yes.
have shown under the head capital gain.
Yes, sir.
Sir, 41(2), I think you are referring to section 41(2). To the extent of recoupment of depreciation, it was treated as business income, but that was deleted from 1488. And I think here under consideration is 2003-4. Sir, you are rightly cited the this judgment of Supreme Court, where they said, though when they are dealing in securities, though it is taxed under the specific head of interest on securities, it has a character of business income.
Yes.
Similarly, there are a number of judgments which they have said, if you are dealing in shares, then though dividend income is taxed under other sources, it is to be nature is business income.
Yes, sir.
But here in this case, so Your Honor, I just want to know this character of this asset is a business asset.
Yes, sir.
You are not. It is used for the purpose of business.
Yes.
Plant and building, etc., is used for the purpose of business.
Yes.
But you are not dealing in this asset. So whether can you still consider it to be a business income?
Yes, sir. That was the precise finding of the court. See, in this case, the assessee has claimed the depreciation. So these assets were otherwise used for generating the income of the business, no, sir?
No, that is what I'm pointing out a distinction and trying to understand. There are two things. One, if you are dealing in that particular asset, then definitely it is your business income.
Yes.
But if the asset is used for, just for the purpose of business, like in this case building or say plant and machinery,
Yes.
because of specific section of section 50, that will be taxed under the head short-term capital gain.
Yes.
But I have a doubt whether it can be termed as business income, because you are not dealing in these assets.
I'll try to cover both my cases, but first I'll discuss the case of CIT exemptions versus Bhatanagar Education and Research Trust. It is a decision of the Supreme Court of India, and this is a very interesting decision. After reading this decision and looking at the history of Section 12AA, there were many questions in my mind, and I hope to discuss the same with you. So I'll very quickly take everybody through the facts of this case, because the facts out here, the timeline, I feel is very important. So here our assessee is a charitable trust which was granted registered by the DIT exemptions in August 2010, and that it is not disputed by it is an undisputed fact that the objects of the trust are charitable in nature, and they've not been called into question during the proceedings or anywhere before the proceedings. Now, in the year 2015, a survey was conducted under Section 133A of the Act under another trust called just a second. Excuse me. Just a second. I've forgotten the full name. Called SHGNPA. I'm forgotten the full name right now, but SHGNPH. And during the survey, the statements of the secretary and treasurer of that SHGNPH trust were recorded. Now, in that statements, both the secretary and the treasurer of SHGNPH had accepted and had given details of bogus donations which were received, and then they were returned through checks and other forms. Also, during the proceedings against SHGNPH for cancellation of registration, which was granted under Section 12A, the secretary of SHGNPH in a letter has accepted this fact of bogus donations, and they have also given a list to the department of bogus donations made by them to other trusts and societies. Now, the ITAT, the last fact-finding authority, has, looking at the record below, has said that it is not disputed that the name of the assessee, that is Bhatanagar Education and Research Trust, is also there in that list. And the modus operandi was that whenever they're giving out certain donations to any trust and societies, this SHGNPH, they would show that donation given out as a revenue expenditure, as an expenditure in their trust. So donations given by SHGNPH to Bhatanagar Education and Research Trust were against cash receipts. So they gave a donation, and Bhatanagar Education and Research Trust gave them back that amount in cash. And this amount was rupees 1,23,87,550 rupees. Prakash ji, the next slide, please. So now, when all of this was happening on the basis of the information that the department received from the survey conducted before SHGNPH and the information received during the proceedings under Section 12AA3, cancellation of registration, again SHGNPH, the department also started investigating, looking into the case of the assessee in question, that is Bhatanagar Trust. And they conducted another survey in the case of the assessee. Now here, the managing trustee of the assessee has clearly accepted in his statement that the assessee got donations from SHGNPH and he paid back in cash. Now, if people are comfortable, I would just quickly read the exact answer that he gave. And that answer, just a second. So I want to read out the answer, one of the answers that the managing trustee of the assessee gave. That is at page 6 of the judgment in the ITR version, and it will be para 4 of the Supreme Court decision. So I am reading out question number 14. In response to the earlier question, you've stated that you were instructed. Who gave you the instruction? Now, what the managing trustee has answered here is, I can remember only one name now, that is Sri Gulab Pincha, mobile number so-and-so. He was the key person for providing a large part of bogus donation received, which was immediately returned back to the different parties in the guise of payments towards capital expenditure in building. We do not know any details in respect of the donors on behalf of whom Sri Gulab Pincha acted as a middleman. Sri Pincha provided us with the details of the donors, check of the donations, letters of corpus donations, etc. He also provided us with the names and bank account details of the 7 persons mentioned in answer 13 to whom money has to be returned back through real-time gross settlement. He also collected the money receipts / ATG certifications on behalf of the donors. So this was the statement made by the managing trustee. Now we are all aware that the statements made under 133A, because they're not under oath, they do not have any evidentiary value per se. But these statements were relied upon by the department. And on the basis of these statements of the managing trustee and show cause notice in 2015, December 2015, was issued to the assessee under section 12A of the Act. The proceedings took place before the CITE. I was trying to find out if I could get an order of the CITE, but I could not get the detailed order. So I'm just relying on what has been extracted by the IGAT in the order. So the CITE gave some very clear findings that the assessee received bogus donations, which admittedly from SHG and PH, and he has received bogus donations from other parties as well. Now, what are the other parties? That has not been specified in the CIT exemptions orders. The CIT exemption is of the view that the assessee misused the provisions of section 12AA and section ATG 5. Objects of the trust were violated. Corpus donation received by the assessee was in the nature of an accommodation entry, because there was no act there, and they're completely fictitious. And the activities are not genuine under section 12AA subsection 3. So they are not genuine, and therefore they're covered by section 12AA subsection 3. And the assessee was engaged in the illegal activities of money laundering, which do not fall under the concept of charitable purpose as defined in section 2 subsection 15 of the Income Tax Act. I will quickly read subsection 2 subsection 15 for everybody's benefit. Charitable purpose. Charitable purpose includes relief of the poor, education, yoga, medical relief, preservation of environment, including watersheds, forests, and wildlife, and preservation of monuments or places or objects of artistic or historic interest, and the advancement of any other object of general public utility. Provided that advancement of any other object of general public utility shall not be a charitable purpose if it involves the carrying on of any activity in the nature of trade, commerce, or business, or any activity of rendering any service in relation to any trade, commerce, or business for a cess or fee or any other consideration, irrespective of the nature of use or application or retention of the income from such activity, unless such activity is undertaken in the course of actual carrying out of such advancement of any object of general public utility, and the aggregate receipts from such activity or activities during the previous year do not exceed 20% of the total receipts of the trust or institution undertaking such activity or activities of that previous year. So the CIT exemption took a clear view that this activity, the activity of receiving bogus donations and then giving back cash is actually money laundering, and in no manner whatsoever would fall under the definition of charitable purpose under section 215. And it is not even an act of charity. Even if you look at the general meaning of the term, general meaning of section 2 subsection 15, sorry, general meaning of charitable purpose, it is not a charitable purpose what they are doing. Prakashji, could you please take me to the next slide? So now the ITAT examined all the statements given, examined the statements given by the managing trustee. They extracted that statement and they've relied on the managing trustee statement to give their finding. So as per the IT80, the assessee has not counted the evidence produced by the department. So the onus and the burden of proof while cancellation of registration under section 12AA3 would lie on the department, because this is an existing registration and the department has decided that they want to cancel it because they are not satisfied by the genuineness of the trust. So onus lies on the department, but when that onus has been satisfied by the department, and if it has not been countered by the assessee, the IT80 said, since it has not been countered by the assessee, they are going to rely on the decision of the CIT exemption, which is correct and does not call for any interference in their view. Also, as per the evidence on record, IT80 has taken the view that the activities of the assessee, that is the trust, were not genuine, and therefore the registration is liable to be cancelled under section 12AA3 of the Act, and they have upheld the order of the CITE. Now, the High Court, the decision of the IT80 was appealed against by the assessee by the High Court under section 260A, of the High Court, and the High Court decided this on 9th of October 2018. Prakash, can you take me? Yes, thank you. So the substantial question of law before the High Court was framed in July 2018. The substantial question was whether the tribunal and the Commissioner of Income Tax Exemptions were right in law in directing the cancellation of registration of the appellant granted under section 12AA to the appellant trust on the ground that the trust had received bogus donation from School of Human Genetics and Population Health, that is SHGNPH, whether the statement recorded in the course of survey under section 133A of the Act has any probative or evidentiary value. Now, the High Court answered question number 1 in favor of the assessee, and it held that the revenue was unable to establish its case, which was warranting the cancellation of the registration of trust, and order of the CIT was set aside. Now, if we look at the order of the High Court, it is a very brief order. Not much has been argued, not much has been argued on merits. They have not gone into the facts. And even the question, the substantial question of law framed by the High Court has not been discussed by the High Court in its final order. So against this order of the High Court, the department went in appeal before the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court allowed the appeal of the department and restored the order of the CIT exemption. Now, the findings of the Supreme Court are very clear. The High Court, first of all, they said that the High Court should not have entertained this appeal under section 260A, and the High Court has not even dealt with the questions raised. So now, any appeal under section 260A should raise a substantial question of law. And if there is a question of fact, then a question of fact is only admitted under section 260A if the facts are perverse. So it has to be argued and contended under the 260A appeal that the findings of fact are completely perverse. So here the substantial question, I feel, that whether the trust was carrying out certain activity, these type of activities which were charitable and the objects were met with, they are a question of law, and in certain cases they can be a mixed question of law and fact. So Supreme Court has taken a view that they should not have entertained it under section 260A. The Supreme Court has also relied on the statement of the managing trustee, which indicated the misuse of the status of the trust, because the managing trustee has himself said that because they were registered under section 80G5 and because they were granted registration under section 12A, they were in a position to accept corpus donations which were actually bogus, and they were able to return them in cash, and they were also able to provide accommodation entries. So on the basis of this, the Supreme Court cancelled the registration of the Supreme Court upheld the order of the CITE, which had cancelled the registration of the which had cancelled the registration of the trust. So this is what has been held in a nutshell by the Supreme Court. Now, I would like to quickly discuss the powers of the Commissioner for cancelling registration under section 12AA. Now, this power was first introduced by the Finance Act, of 2004. So earlier, the intent of the legislature, it is clearly read that it was if the power has been granted to the commissioner to grant registration, then it flows from that power that the commissioner also has the power to cancel that registration. But there was a lot of litigation regarding that. One of the leading cases at that time was this decision of the Gujarat High Court in the case of Hira Lal. I have referred to that earlier in my slides. So to clarify that position that the Commissioner Income Tax has the power to cancel the registration, they specifically introduced Section 12AA subsection 3 to the Act, and this subsection was supposed to take effect from 1st of October 2004. Prakashji, next slide, please.
Yes, ma'am.
So I have taken out an extract of the memorandum to the Finance Act, which clearly says that it is proposed to provide that if the Commissioner of Income Tax is satisfied that the activities of any trust or institution are not genuine or are not being carried out in accordance with the objects of the trust or institution, he shall, after giving reasonable opportunity of being heard, to the concerned trust pass an order in writing cancelling the registration granted under the said section. Now, if you look back at this decision, look back at the case of Bhatanagar Education and Trust, it's very interesting. The ITT has clearly said that it is not disputed that the objects of the trust were charitable, and the objectives of the trust were charitable, and on basis of that, that registration was given. But only when it came to light that the trust is engaged in illegal activities, did the CIT exemption decide that this trust has to be cancelled. So the question is, are we clearly following the provisions of Section 12AA? Because objects of the trust are charitable. It is what the trust is actually doing under the objects of the trust that is illegal. So that is one very interesting question that comes into play. Now, Prakashji, could you please take me to the next slide?
Yes, ma'am. You are on the next slide.
Thank you. So the Finance Act, the Section 12AA was further amended by the Finance Act of 2010 because it was disputed whether the CIT has the power to cancel trust before the period of 2004. So to clarify that, they came up with this amendment where they have added the word that where a trust or an institution has been granted registration under clause B of subsection, has been granted registration under clause B of subsection 1, or has obtained, this is the amended part, or has obtained registration at any time under section 12A as it stood before its amendment by the Finance Act of 1996. So to clarify further that the CIT has powers, they amended this Section 12AA subsection 3 further, and they also issued a circular clarifying that. Prakashji, next slide. That's circular number 1 of 2011. So the circular clearly clarifies that the power of cancellation of registration is inherent and flows from the authority granting registration. However, judicial rulings in some cases have held that the commissioner does not have the power to cancel the registration, which was obtained earlier by any trust or institutions under the provisions of Section 12A, as it is not specifically mentioned in Section 12AA. Therefore, Section 12AA has been amended to provide that the commissioner can also cancel the registration obtained under Section 12A as it stood before the amendment by Finance Act of 1996. This amendment has been made applicable with effect from June 2020 and shall accordingly apply for assessment year 2011, 2012 and subsequent years. Now, it is clear from from the earlier provision and from this provision that the Commissioner of Income Tax for the first time acquired the power of cancelling registration granting under Section 12A of the Act to the trust only with effect from 1st of June 2010 under the amended Section 12AA3 of the Act, because till then it was not flowing out clearly from the provisions of the Act. Now, excuse me. So by the Finance Act of 2014, subsection 4 was also added to the section for cancellation, because earlier the powers of the commissioner were very restricted, and they were restricted if the activities of the trust or institution are not genuine, or the activities are not being carried out in accordance with the objects of the trust or institution. 12A8 subsection 4 further widened this further widened the powers of the commissioner to cancel the trust, and included certain situations under its purview. Prakash ji, could you take me to the next, skip 2 slides. Next slide, please. Next slide. The slide after this. So the newly added 12AA4 said that the CITE can now cancel registrations if the income of the trust does not ensure the benefit of general public, if it is for the benefit of any particular religious community or caste, in case it is established after the commencement of the act. Any income or property of the trust is applied for benefit of specified persons like author of trust, trustees, etc. And the trust funds are invested in prohibited modes. Then the principal commissioner may cancel the registration if such trust does not prove that there was a reasonable cause for the activities to be carried out in the above manner. And this amendment was with effect from 2014. So this is how the act now reads with regards to the power of the commissioner income tax and the revenue to cancel the registration of the trust. Now, when there is a cancellation of registration of trust, the section 11, 12, 12A, they are considered to be a code by itself. So would the other provisions of the act apply? Of course, they would apply. Because these provisions, while they are a code by themselves, they are notwithstanding to any other provision of the act, and therefore the rules of section 133A, 132, everything, all the other provisions would apply. These provisions have streamlined a lot of existing decisions of the Supreme Court, where there was a question regarding the powers of the department on the cancellation of the trust. Now, the decision and this decision itself, the decision of the Supreme Court in Bhatanagar, has again streamlined the question that earlier it was a question that assessing officer cannot question the validity on objects of a trust, whether charitable or not, since that issue lies with the registering authority. So this amendments and this judgment have again reiterated that the CIT exemption has that power. Now, on whom does the burden of proof lie? And in proceedings under section 12AA, as I said before, when the CIT exemption is passing its order for cancelling the trust, as per the principles laid by the Supreme Court in KP Varghese and Sati Oil Udyog, the burden of proof will lie in prima facie on the department to say that the provisions of 12AA3 or 12AA4 are attracted. But the assessee, that is the trust, would also have to show cause and counter the material relied upon by the department. If they are not countering the material relied upon by the department, then they are hit by this decision of Bhatanagar Education Trust, which I think so has tacitly clarified that the assessee has to show cause as to why the registration should not be cancelled. Now, one question that comes into my mind is retrospective cancellation of registration and reopening of assessments thereafter. So in this case, the trust was cancelled with effect from the decision of the CIT. Just a second. So the decision of the CIT exemption is 2016. In 2016, the CIT exemption cancelled the registration of the SSC. But that has been done with effect from 2012. And the registration was granted to our assessee in 2010. So in such a situation, when the registration has been cancelled, now it logically flows that the income would have to be added to the assessee, that is Batanagar Education and Trust, and assessments would have to be reopened. So we will be bound by the provisions of section 147 and 148. So those provisions are they say that 3 years, and in case of serious fraud for an amount exceeding 50 lakhs, that has been extended up to 10 years. But what happens when a litigation goes on further? What happens that? Does the time limit under section 147 gets paused? Now, I feel that is a lacuna in the law, that there is no, this has not been considered. Also, the fact that section 12AA3, section 12AA and 12AA3 and 12AA4 don't prescribe any time limits, that also I feel is a blind spot in the law. Now, the Prakashji, which slide?
Yes, ma'am.
Can we go to the? Can we go further?
Yes, ma'am.
Further. So this decision, the ITAT, the Jaipur bench of the ITAT, in a decision of January 2021, held that the CIT cannot cancel registration of a trust retrospectively, and there they relied on decisions of various high courts. And in a lot of those decisions, it was discussed that these 12AA3, since 12AA3 has not been given any retrospective effect, therefore the powers are also should not be applied retrospectively. But here, the CIT exemption actually got the power to cancel a trust from effective date of 2010. In our case, he exercised the power in 2016 and cancelled it with effect from 2012. The Supreme Court has upheld the decision of the CIT. So is the Supreme Court tacitly in a tacit manner overturning this principle? Does this decision of the Supreme Court give assent that yes, registration of a trust can be cancelled with retrospective effect? The Supreme Court has not explicitly said this, and now this I think is a very good point of being argued, and it is a point which can be taken up both by the department and the assessee, and the courts will have to then interpret the decision of Batanagar Education and Research Trust to finally decide whether the CIT can cancel the registration of a trust retrospectively on the basis of the decision of the Supreme Court in Batanagar Education and Trust. So these are my views on this decision of the Supreme Court.
Yeah, thank you, ma'am. Thank you for summarizing this important case law. And we have some few questions on this case law here, and a few questions that we have received from the other participant also. We will like to discuss that part. But for a moment, I'm just stopping the sharing of the PPT, and we can have some Q&A before we hand over to the president or to the chairman of this session here. Yes, ma'am. The first question that is there, in this case, the order of the CIT exemption was there against the SSC. ITT was against the SSC. The High Court was in favor of the SSC, and the Supreme Court was against the SSC. So the first issue is arising whether what led the High Court to change its mind, because of how the High Court has viewed this complete transaction, and why the High Court says that no, it is not a good case for the purpose of cancellation of this registration.
So, Prakashji, thank you for this question. The High Court's order is only 2 pages, and it is a very bare order. And in my view, I can only give my view. In my view, it has not been contented properly, and therefore the High Court simply, in a very summarily manner, said that we have now they have given the answer in favor of the assessee, and they have said that the order of cancellation of the registration of the trust is set aside. The respondent is on the basis of the evidence and the authorities cited above before the adjudicating bodies below, we say that the respondent revenue has not been able to establish the case so as to warrant cancellation of the registration of the appellant trust under section 12AA3 of the Act. The respondent also has not been able to prove any complicity of the appellant trust in any illegal, immoral, or irregular activities of the donors. This is what the High Court has said. From the High Court order, they have not gone into the discussion of the statement of the managing trustee. The revenue has not raised, from whatever I can make from the order of the High Court, the revenue has not raised any arguments, any strong arguments to state that the activities of the trust are illegal. And the only submission by the revenue was that there are many trusts which have created to be used for the illegal purpose of money laundering, and therefore this trust should also be, this trust is one such trust, and it should be cancelled. So the High Court, looking at these bare skeletal submissions, I think so took the view that the order of the CIT exemptions is incorrect, order of the ITAT is incorrect, and that's why they set aside the orders. Because there was hardly any discussion on the statements and the material document, statement and the material relied upon by the CIT exemption. Because there was not any discussion like that, the High Court has summarily decided this matter.
Yes, one question, one more question, along with Ruchesh sir. Ruchesh ji, are you hooked up right now? Can you come? Can you switch on your camera? Ruchesh sir. Ruchesh ji.
Sir, I have.
Yes, sir. Now we have the Kartik case. Now we have the Batanagar case. In the Kartik case, the statement under the oath was relied for the purpose of framing the 153C assessment here. In the case of the Batanagar, the statement of the secretary under the 133, it was not an oath. It was relied for the purpose of determining that the trust is not genuine.
Yes.
There is no evidence in both the cases. As far as it is only on the reliance of the statement by some officers here. In both the cases, in first cases we have seen that Kartik cases still the assessment has to be taken place, but many more reliance has been given to the statement of the three persons. Here, a statement of the secretary has been relied, and the Supreme Court in the last para has stated that rely on the, it is last para, it says that go to the statement which is recorded by the CIT under 133 and relied on that statement. How do you feel? What is the trend which is going on? Mere reliance on the statement is going to be a new march of the law, or whether the revenue will be asked to prove something more?
Sir, Honorable Sudhanshu ji will agree with me. Sir, you know, there are CBDT circular also on this point, sir. Sir will agree with me that, you know, specifically in the case of search and survey proceedings, 153A, 153C, then 148, then CIT exemption, they come to your business premise to XYZ residence and they record the statement. So there are repeated circular. I will just quote after. I am not keeping that handy. That the undisclosed income, the uncorroborated income should not be, the statement of the assessee should not be taken. The assessment, etc., should be framed on independent application of mind, and the practice of recording the statement of the assessee should be denuded, basically. So, if at all the statements are recorded, and see, ultimately they have to record your statement, but after that, what they have recorded, what you have said, a proper clarification or a retraction, then supported by other things that, you know, even you have recorded my statement, but your own circular, your own apex body, that is CBDT, says that the contents of the statement should be corroborated by independent inquiry and evidence, etc. So you please keep that on record. Number one. Number two, as we always see, sir has seen in hundreds of cases, that we always take the plea of cross-examination. And I don't see that in 100 out of 99 cases, they give us cross-examination, basically. Now, the Indian Evidence Act, if I am correctly remember, section 31 of the Indian Evidence Act says that mere reliance on the statement cannot be taken. So, Sana sir, what I am just trying to say, to put a straight jacket formula, it is very, very difficult. It all depends upon case to case. A statement of the director is recorded, or some worker is recorded, or some person which is absolutely unrelated is recorded, under what circumstances, what he has said. So all these things has to be taken into consideration, basically. However, being said so, see, you consider the case of income tax, you consider the case of anything, they have to record the statement ultimately. But it is your advocacy, it is your legality, that how you should come out of that statement, basically. So I am trying to say, to generalize this thing is very, very, it is not easy. It cannot be said in a one blush, basically.
Thanks, sir. Madam, Isita ma'am,
Yes, Prakash ji.
whether your argument would have been different if you would have the SSC counsel in the Supreme Court in the case of the Batanagar Trust?
Yes, if I was the SSC counsel, actually, I would have tried for a remand.
You would have tried for the remand
I
here.
would have tried for it. First of all, I would have honestly tried for a remand, I feel, because I would have then tried to go back to the war and make stronger statements. What the ITAT has said, what the ITAT has clearly given a finding at the time of its order is that the assessee has not contended the material relied upon by the revenue. So at that point, I would have to make a very strong statement. I would have had to make a statement and contested the statement, the reliance of the department on my statement, on the statement of the assessee taken under section 133A. Also, one argument that should have been taken before the Supreme Court is the Section 12AA3 says that objects of the trust have to be illegal. And it has been accepted by the ITAT, it has been accepted by the ITAT that the objects of the trust are not illegal. So they have to prove that the objects of the trust are not illegal. And 12AA, within the four corners of 12AA, the power, like what I do as a money laundering activity, or what I do otherwise, is not the fault of the trust. It is the people running the trust. They did that. But the trust registration should not be cancelled, because if it was still carrying out its legal purpose, then don't cancel the registration of the trust. Go behind, take your fresh proceed, go behind the people who are running it. So the trust per se, the assessee should not be persecuted for any illegal activity being done under its garb.
Madam, one of our learned participant, and he is also the ITAT member, Prasad Mercy sir, is he has written something, and it might be my privilege to read his comment, what he has written on, what he has said on the case of the Batanagar. He says that Batanagar case was a survey, and over and above statement there was in evidence that no charitable activities was carried on. So Prasad sir says that yes, it was on the record that no charitable activity was carried on apart from the statement which it was recorded. So it was not only the issue of the statement, but also on the fact sheet which was done by the CIT exemption, and it has been proved. But the issue was there, but I feel that it was never rebutted by the SSC when the so-called notice was issued to the SSC for his rebuttal, when the opportunity was given while cancellation this one. So it was never been rebutted by this SSC here. I feel that was the time when this case went wrong against the SSC. Do you agree with me or not?
I agree with you wholeheartedly here that at the time of show cause notice and at the time of pleadings before the ITAT, the assessee did not make a very strong case of putting objections on the material relied upon by the department.
Okay. Thank you for your summary, ma'am. And now I will come to the Ruchesh sir for 1 minute here. Ruchesh sir, if you would have been the counsel of the SSC petitioner in the case of the Kartik, what would have been your argument so that case could have been something else?
Sir, very, very simple and fundamental argument. See, 148 issued, 148 dropped, After that, they issued them 153C notice. Now, why did they comply to 153C notice? They accepted the jurisdiction. They filed the return under section 153C. They replied to the notices, and when a show cause notice was issued by the assessing officer, then against that show cause notice, they have filed a petition before the High Court, basically. So this is not a correct. So again, you are going into alternative remedy. Now we are challenging this 148 proceeding. You are aware. So we are not accepting the notice. We are challenging the notice at the threshold stage itself, basically, not acceding and accepting to their jurisdiction by filing even the ITR under protest. So number one. Number two, sir, a very, very fundamental argument. Whatever might have been coming from the department side, if I would be the counsel, I would file a simple application of inspection doing nothing. That's sir, 153C notice you have issued me for assessment year 13-14 to 18-19. I am giving you 100 rupees challan. You please give me an inspection of the file. And I would have gone through each and every document, and that is my right, because you are trying to use that document against me. So I will see the satisfaction note of the assessing officer of Agni States, of my assessing officer, the document which he has received, and particularly to refute the point that there should be incrementing material qua each assessment year, because I am supported and armed with single education society. After discussing all those things, I would have discussed the matter with learned seniors who have argued the case, and that I have planned the strategy, sir.
Okay, last question on the Kartik case. If you have been engaged by the SSC right now to argue this case in the Supreme Court, and you are trying to file the SLP in the Supreme Court, what will be your two grounds that you will take to like to argue before the Supreme Court? Only two grounds.
Sir, if that is possible, can I be hired back?
Okay. Hypothetical, so, if you.
I'm just saying on lighter note, sir, just to make sir happy. That's all.
Sir, but Sudhanshu sir, you are on the mute, sir. Yes, sir. You are, sir, please, you are not audible, sir. Please use this mic here. You have used this one. Some. Still you in the.
And you are mute. Yes.
Now you can speak, sir. Now you are not on the mute, sir. But your mic should work.
I think so. He's disallowed the audio. There's some change in audio settings. Sudhanshu sir, if you could just click the button, the tab near the mute, there is a small arrow next to the icon of the mic, and there if you check the options of the speaker, select a microphone and everything. So if you, there maybe you are ticking in the wrong option. If you're using your microphone, you'll have to put in the microphone, the external microphone option. Or if you're using your system, then you'll have to tick the same as system. Maybe that might help. So we cannot hear you.
No problem, sir. No problem. Your presence is itself quite visible from here, and we can understand that you want to speak something here. Yes, sir. My question was remain unanswered by Ruchesh, sir. If you would have been suppose that you have been hired by the Kartik Chidambaram to argue his case in the Supreme Court. Only two grounds of law that you would like to argue.
Sir, I cannot change the facts of the case as it is. And if you ask me frankly, it is a very judgment given by the court. However, having said so, the judgment has been given by the single judge, basically. So I would have primarily challenged the proviso of section 153A, saying that, in the way the proceedings has been conducted by the assessing officer, they are using the proviso just as a personal vendetta against me. And I would say, if I may use the right word, I would influence the Supreme Court by saying that they have initiated a prosecution against me. I was even sir was the prosecution counsel. He will like to correct me. Prosecution, they have I have already going through the prosecution side. Then I have filed the discharge application before the session. Before the CMM, that was dismissed. I have gone it before the session court, that was dismissed, and I have got the relief only by the High Court. And in that case also, the same transaction of Agni was being contended, basically. So the prosecution was, I got the relief from the Honorable High Court on the issue that the prosecution is premature, because you cannot determine the quantum of tax under section 276C and 277 unless and until you carry on my assessment, basically. So just to make my argument or say influence the mind of the court, I would have taken that, sir, you please see the background which I have faced which I am facing. It is not a regular assessment. This is a kind of personal vendetta which the department is going against me, basically.
I hope that Kartik Chidambaram must be listening to you, and he will be thinking of you in for his Supreme Court matters here. And very last point here, which from my side, and after that, Sudhanshu sir is typing something, and he is trying to give some message on that part. I will read that message. But last point here, you have been a revenue counsel for years here.
Yes, sir.
Right now, in the case of the Nandi Steel, the revenue has lost its case in the Karnataka High Court. Yes. If you would have been the revenue counsel in the Supreme Court, what will be your argument in the case of the Nandi Steel?
Sir, the same argument, if I am very, very honest, the same argument which has been taken by the revenue counsel before the High Court, that are very, very relevant, counsel, because in this case, the income arising from the sale of assets has been declared by the assessee under the capital gain itself, basically. So, that is not our case, that is his case only. So I would harp upon this point only, that, sir, it is the case of the assessee only when he is himself admitting that the income arising from the sale of land and building and borewell are capital assets, meaning thereby that they are capital assets. So then how can you set off, basically?
But this argument was rejected by the High Court.
Rejected, sir, rejected.
Yes.
But still it's a valid argument, Sana Saab, in my view.
Okay. Thanks from my side here. Ashok Sharma sir, if you have any questions, sir?
No, only the thing that the same thing, whether are we concluding that this business asset sold, it can be assessed as a business income?
No, sir, no.
See,
Sir,
at the most, according to me, at the most, as you rightly said, to the extent of recoupment of depreciation, that is 41.2 to earlier provision 41.2, which is not there now. To that extent, it can be business income. Otherwise, in my view, it cannot be business income if you sell a business asset. It's a point for consideration.
Very well, sir. But in my humble view, I think 41.2 is still there. I need to check.
No. It's
but
not,
I am having.
it is only for power companies.
Okay. 41.2 I am having.
No, it is only for power companies. It was deleted for others.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, from my side, the session is concluded here.